This is a short presentation on the UK government's package of reforms to Habitats Regulations Appraisal, or HRA, known as the Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package, and reflecting on what this means for HRA derogations and delivering compensatory measures. The presentation will follow these broad headings, looking at the detail of the legislation and the Marine Scotland perspective on this. But first, I'll start with a quick refresh on the derogations procedures in HRA. Under the current HRA legislation, a panel project cannot be consented or adopted if it could have an adverse effect on site integrity. So that's part of the national network of protected sites that include special areas of conservation and special protection areas. However, derogations, as they're known, can be considered where impacts cannot otherwise be avoided, reduced, or mitigated. This can be done via three tests. Firstly, there must be no alternative means of proceeding with a plan or project that would lower the risk and that the public benefit outweighs the risk of environmental damage. There must be imperative reasons of overriding public interest, and where these tests apply, there's then a duty on the plan or project to secure compensatory measures, and the relevant public authority cannot consent a project unless these measures are secured. Compensatory measures might typically consist of orders for the cessation of certain activities and/or habitat enhancement and management. However, there's a number of challenges that make delivering compensatory measures complex. I've just lifted a few themes from the discussions and concerns that you may hear in relation to delivering offshore wind projects onto this slide. The underlying theme boils down to a simple consideration. Can all of the leased offshore wind projects secure the necessary compensatory measures to secure consents while ensuring environmental protection? This is recognised as a really key area of consideration by both Scottish and UK governments. And the UK government have attempted to look at reformation of HRA in relation to offshore wind projects in the Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package as a way to explore options to coordinate action and decisions on compensatory measures. The next few slides give a little bit more detail on the UK government's work on the package of measures, and then we'll quickly step through some of Marine Scotland's reflections on these. After a bit of discrete consultation activity in late spring 2022, the Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package HRA reforms were tabled as legislative amendments to the UK's Energy Bill on the 9th of January 2023 and debated at the House of Lords Committee on the 16th of January. The bill will have a final reading in the Lords in February before then proceeding to go into the Commons for debate there. There are 6 new clauses inserted into the Energy Bill, providing a range of new powers and procedures. Firstly, there are powers to make provision in regulations for a revised process for the assessment of environmental impacts on protected sites from offshore wind and associated infrastructure in the marine environment. Scottish ministers can regulate the inshore area, but the Secretary of State has reserved powers for the offshore area. The UK government are wishing to manage what they call the risk of a regulatory gap between these two areas by consultation to ensure policies are aligned and joined up across administrative boundaries. In regards to strategic compensation, the regulations make provision about compensatory measures that can be provided for any adverse environmental effects of offshore wind projects on protected sites. The intention is for government to use these powers to move the assessment of mitigation measures or the effectiveness of mitigation measures to an earlier stage so that they are deemed as assessed or discounted from the appropriate assessment, and thereby shortening the overall habitat regulations appraisal process. The package of measures recognise that the scale of offshore wind is likely to exceed the ability of developers to provide sufficient compensation on an individual project-specific basis, and that impacts on sites are likely to come from several offshore wind projects. These factors create a requirement for strategic compensation measures or measures that can be applied across a number of these projects. The UK government intends to agree a list of approved compensatory measures and to consider a broader approach than the current like-for-like requirement, where these measures have not always been possible. And therefore enabling compensatory measures that improve wider marine ecosystems, but are not targeted at specific impacted habitat species or protected areas. The goal really is for developers to understand whether strategic compensatory measures will be suitable for their projects, which strategic compensatory measures they should consider prior to submission of their development proposal, whether these can be delivered through a new marine recovery fund, and the extent to which conditions imposed on a developer under their consent could be discharged upon payment into the marine recovery fund. The aim really of the reforms is to consider and deliver strategic compensation early and across projects and organisations, all in order to reduce consenting time. And this could include measures delivered by a group of developers, but could also be measures that maybe are only able to be delivered by government, such as enhanced management of the MPA. So a great deal of importance is really being placed on the Marine Recovery Fund to deliver on strategic compensation measures. As the clauses stand at the moment, it will be for the UK Government's Secretary of State to pass regulations on the establishment of one or more marine recovery funds. The UK Government could then operate a UK-wide fund or a series of individual funds, and or delegate the establishing of funds to other public bodies. The Marine Recovery Fund would not be a statutory requirement. It wouldn't remove the option for developers to deliver strategic compensation collaboratively across a number of projects, or to deliver individual project compensation. If there are sufficient contributions to the fund, these could enable governments to deliver compensatory measures where these are within government powers, as well as the actions that would be led by developers. However, at present there's little information on how a marine recovery fund would operate in practice, and much of the detail is intended to be settled now in secondary pieces of legislation. So this is just a quick slide to highlight that the clauses as introduced in the Energy Bill do not address all aspects of the offshore wind environmental improvement package. For example, the UK Government intends to undertake and complete some further work on offshore wind environmental standards and on strategic monitoring. And again, detail on this has been limited at the moment. As I sort of mentioned before, much of the detail on how the clauses in the bill will operate in practice will be settled in secondary legislation. That includes regulations dealing with the assessment in the inshore and offshore regions, as well as the rules on how marine recovery funds might operate. One thing also to note is that whilst originally considered in the offshore wind environmental improvement package, marine net gain now appears to have been dropped from their programme of further work. So that's the summary of the UK Government's work so far, but what are our reflections? Well, Marine Scotland have voiced a number of concerns, from the provisions not seeking the consent of the Scottish Government and simply consulting us, to concerns that in promoting compensation across the national network of sites, there could be some first come, first served issues where compensatory measures in Scotland might be swallowed up by wider UK projects, and this before any Scottish projects that would be able to utilise them are in a position to agree that these are suitable. We've strongly indicated that anything that limits access to Scottish-based compensation for Scottish projects is counterproductive for all. On the Marine Recovery Fund, we've voiced concerns on its effectiveness, the lack of clarity on its operation, and therefore how likely industry can or will be able to utilise it. Whilst there may be a role for government action, can the UK Government realistically act as guarantors of success of any strategic compensation? What are the upfront costs? Are there hidden additional costs for the developer? How reliant on uptake will the success of potential measures be? In discharging commitments via payments, are developers able to cut and run? And who is responsible if the measures are not successful? So Scottish ministers are considering their position on whether they would wish to establish a bespoke Scottish fund. Early indications are that this would not safeguard Scottish measures for Scottish projects. So we see a number of challenges, really. And, there is a potential for divergent regimes between the inshore and offshore regions. There's significant uncertainty, as I say, on how the Marine Recovery Fund may operate in practice. And whilst sharing and in a way banking of compensatory measures across projects is helpful, we have to understand how the interplay between Scottish and English projects will continue into the future. So in our opinion, movement from like for like compensation to some broader options and the encouraging of collaborative delivery of compensation measures could be positive outcomes, and we've been welcomed work in that area. But in terms of what is excluded, we're disappointed that marine enhancement has been dropped from consideration in the offshore wind environmental improvement package. We'd like to look again at whether marine net gain could be a consideration in HRA. We're also disappointed at the lack of depth, really, of industry consultation on the offshore wind environmental improvement package. And we think that the work could have been significantly improved and could significantly benefited from further consultation, especially during last year, where the leadership issues left an elongated timetable for delivery of the measures. Marine Scotland feel that it's vital that industry and other stakeholders have a voice in considering the proposals, especially if they're to be considered as likely to be successful, and or they will provide opportunities industry will actually take up. So some disappointment on the level of consultation. So overall, really, we have residual concerns on whether the package of measures will achieve what it hopes to do in providing a sufficient basis to achieve the development we require to progress to net zero. The Scottish Government will continue to work to influence the UK Government on secondary legislation, and we'll be progressing with some of our own work to look at potentially appropriate compensation for the potential impacts we might consider will arise for levels of development that we will see in Scotland. And so we've reached the end of the presentation, and I'll stop talking. So what I'll do is I will open up the floor to some questions. Thank you.